So today we start a 13-part series of what was received and written down by Michel Salomon de Orange. I think that's how you pronounce his name. Correct me if I'm wrong, because I never learned how to read French. And I never think to when I'm able to. So
I'm sure you
so
can
he just claims that this is what he received and that he's not claiming it's definitely the thing, and that prayer and meditation and that sort of thing has an effect on the future. But so one thing that the Ordo Templi Astartes, the Church of Hermetic Sciences, does is they have a ritual in which they swear on a Bible open to the story of Solomon. So let's, through the series of this program, there's like 24 verses that can be gone. Well, probably more than 24 verses, but we'll go over the story of Solomon via Quran. And so the first mention that we can take a look at is Surah 2, ayat 97 to 103. And to open and get oneself in the mood for each of these ones before we read it to ourselves, I'm going to include part of the evening ritual, and I'm going to, I don't know if you can see that in this light, but I have a Solomonic circle snake pillow here. And so I'm going to include part of my evening ritual in each of the programs too.
Oh, awesome. Okay.
So facing the 4 directions: east, west, north, south, Mecca, Jerusalem, the Great Pyramid, in whatever order one wants, but it's better to, kind of rotate in the circle, Swan, 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 swan. Now in North America, you turn towards the left a little bit to face Jerusalem from where you're facing Mecca. And the Great Pyramid would, of course, be, instead of facing the northeast, you face the southeast in a way. And and opening one's hand, and putting your hand on the Quran, this first passage that mentions the issue related to Solomon. Man kana duwan Jibrila fanahu nazalahu ala qalbika bidnila musadiqan ma bina yanayya hudan wa bushra lil mu'minin. Man kana duwan Allah wa malaikatihi wa rasulihi wajibile wa mikala fanala duwan kafirin wala qadam zanna alayka ayatan bayinatin wa ma yakfuru bi'al al-fasiqun awwa kullama hadu dan nambadzahu fariqun minhum falaktarhum la yumandun walamma ja'ahum rusulun min dalam sadiqan lamma ma'hum namadzahu fariqun min alladhina utul kitaballahi waras ظهورهم kanahum layalamun Watabau matad mushiatinu alamuke Sulemana wamakafara Sulemanu walakanashiatna kafaru Yuwalamunana sesehra wamaun zelal malakine Babala haruta wamaruta Wamayuwalan manminaharan hatayapula namanahnu bednatun valatakru Vayatalamuna minmayu parekuna behemina marewa zawjahe Wamamindarina behemina hadanella bine La wayatalamuna mayadaruhum walayintohum Wala kadalamun malahu hila keratamin Qalaqan wala besalma sharau beyan fusahum walawan kanu yalamun walawan namanu wa kakula matubatun manandala perunau kanu yalamun. Now, that differs a little bit from the typical Goetic backstory or this Arabian Nights tales and stuff like this, because the idea isn't that they've imprisoned the demons inside of the vessel or any of that sort of stuff in this story. But it does talk about an origin with magic in terms of the Harut and Marut, which relates to Marduk and the female with Marduk before there was this idea of their fighting each other and usurper deities and all that other stuff. But they let the people know what was, and people got into what they were going to get into anyways. Now, I may have said that these 13 accounts, which we were going to talk about, were between January of 2001 and January of 2005. And they relate to Vasago. It's called the Oracles of Sitael. But one of the things that happens in the Church of Hermetic Sciences stuff is that the angel and the demon stuff is worked as a complete system. So here we have the mention of the demons out there teaching the people the forbidden magics, and we have the reference to the angels that not being an enemy to the angels was the idea, because some of these people are like, well, we're going to take this because there are Jews that decide that favor one angel over another, or there's people with their patron saints and all that stuff.
About the demons, do they believe like the demons as being like outside of the person, or do they feel like
in the verses that we're talking about, whether jinn is a demon or it's not a demon, there's not the belief in the fallen angels. Islamically, there's not the belief that, well, I mean, there is, but the jinn are the fallen angels. The demons are they're a different type of creation. In English, we don't get this idea as clearly. Like if you read in the Tanakh, the Bible, if you read it in Aramaic, you get the idea that there's this being of fire. Like I point out in Isaiah 40, I think it is, talks about there's a class of beings that are they're like humans and they're like fire. So they've made their decision. So they're not the same type of creation as other things. So even the Bible, if you read the Bible in its older languages, you don't get this idea that there's a group of angels that all of a sudden they decide to be bad one day. The type of angels that were going to make the decision were always the type of being that they were, and they just made and the ones that weren't going to fall, they're not the same type of creature. So, you know, but there's a lot of confusion in the Western stuff. But the Bible is such a mess, a jumble of some other stuff. So I'm gonna cut off the recording here. And so with the recording back on with that, what are your thoughts with that?
Well, one thing about like a prophecy, for example, a prophecy of war, war has always existed. So, like I would feel like a prophecy that would talk about war, that's pretty broad. Because more than likely, that will definitely come true.
Like,
There's always
of course, they're talking about, of course, in the entry, they talk about Nostradamus. Oh, wait, or they don't talk about Nostradamus. But do they?
no,
Oh,
I
yeah,
think
they do. Nostradamus was himself of French and Jewish origin. So I guess I'm okay saying that quote. So this was interpreted a lot different now than it would have been at the time. At the time, war upon the last 4 lines of these 20 well, not 20 lines, I guess 19 lines. I don't remember them in the video, but well, maybe they edited it down or something, but this all would have been interpreted a lot differently back then. Nowadays, we'd say, what's the case with Kid Rock, for example? There was another musician that they were talking about back in the day that, oh, this reminds us of what's going on with this guy who was known as the Son of the South. While Kid Rock is really a rich guy from the North, rather than he puts himself as a stereotypical redneck. It's like that's his game thing. So we'd look at that. And in Eastern stories, instead of saying, well, a war on Iraq, but things are going to be covered up by what's going on. Now, they, of course, would have thought about, September 11th, because wasn't this, I think this was copyrighted on September 11th or something, when the video or something like that. So they automatically thought of September 11th because they did see stuff that would make them think of buildings going down and all sorts of stuff. So I forget exactly what was said with that. There is a book that has some of their interpretation of it. I think it came with the video. But this thing here, so an Eastern Star is not a rock. It's probably China. Most people are going to say it's China because we're gearing up towards a war with China, which is stupid. Even North Korea or Iran would kill 95% of us. 95% of our country would be killed off if we went to war with either of those countries, because what would they do? They'd launch a nuclear weapon over Kansas or something like this to shut off the power across the country. And then they would hit our big cities. So they may not be able to shut down the world like Russia or China would, but certainly it's not something to mess with. But, and somebody showing their genius, it turned out that George Bush actually was a genius. It's just he was drunk too much for people to remember that part.
I was getting ready to say, like, an outside image, can be portrayed as one thing, but the reality.
Now, I don't know if our current leader is, but see, the presiding one is often somebody who's not actually who we think is the presiding one. It's like who really owns the political offices, or who I call the Nazium. Now, whether you're talking about the Morgans or some other family, they're the ones who really run the show, because you find out, oh, this war was sponsored by J.P. Morgan. This war was sponsored by BlackRock. It's like, well, they don't say that though, but you look into it and that's what's going on. Oh, the World Economic Forum guy wanted us to do this stuff. So they're the thing. But then again, one of the things that they're saying is they're trying to make it sound like it's good for people. It's good for humanity.
Right.
And people don't. One of the things, I've been asked some very severe questions privately, and somebody wanted advice. I'm not saying that they were being mean to me or something, but I've been asked some very severe questions privately. And one of the things that this thing seems to address is something about that, is that all of life is meant to be included in spirituality. Whatever side you are, you're better off if you include your whole life as part of your spirituality, or at least work towards that. And here, the references that we're seeing here, because people act like you can take part in the world, like especially Christianity. You take off the natural man, even your feelings and your emotions and your thoughts are your enemy. You're not supposed to use philosophy, because the Bible said that after Paul, no one's allowed to use philosophy. They don't say once Paul said, but Paul's not allowing anybody to use philosophy, and he was the only one. Him and his company were the only ones allowed to use philosophy. So everybody else was forbidden to use philosophy. And of course, philosophy is not using quotes. Philosophy is the method. So you can follow. So they don't want you to understand the myths and all that. So they divided things, and they made, as long as you're living according to the ethics with the spirit of your spirituality and with the spiritual context that, hey, I'm going to give some charity, or I'm going to use some of this money towards explicitly spiritual things. There's going to be a room in my house where I do rituals, or whatever the deal is. You can definitely merge those two together.
Yeah.
And we're definitely facing, it's like the things that have been going on. It's like from this, we can't really, I'm not sure if we can really say what the thing is, but when we're recording this right now, it's been 3.5 years of strife that we've been facing, and then stuff like that's going to happen. Now, what's going on right now that's not part of the agenda is that volcanoes might melt 38.5 feet, a sea level rise. So we're not worried about the pollution is a deal. They never work on the pollution. They never work on the torture. It's always about, oh, how bad you all are, and you need to be controlled. You need, it's like, no, that just needs to stop.
Yeah. Fear can produce control of the masses. In some organized religions, I can see how it mimics government, as in, fear techniques, fear tactics being used in order to, control people. I think this is how, a small handful of people could control the entire world, is through fear. Fear, one thing is being fear.
And
yeah,
I'm trying to look towards the next. Okay, I found what we're looking for. The next in the next program to look at here, I mean, in the next segment, because it's broken into 5 different segments. So the third section here, there's more to the oracle, but it's more about dogma of the group. So if you watch that video, the Dark Mirror of Magic, there's also the Magic of Solomon that tells you how to do their thing. The book tells more stuff. But the next segment also reminds us of what happens with, people, they divide their theology. One of the main reasons why people turn to Satanism is because something's missing. It's like, if you look at the Bible, a lot of things are missing from its theology, and therefore you find in these grimoires, there's entities that one turns to in these issues. And yeah.
I think sometimes, and some people want to follow. Well, for me, it's
and different modes of life. And you tell that oh, everything's about being kind and nice and all this. So sometimes things are, you got to ignore things. Some things you got to act harsh and react in that way.
Yeah. It's. I was just thinking earlier, about certain religions where it's threatened that people will burn forever, in hell, if they're not good.
And that's another reason why I have favored towards the Quranic mention of that stuff, because one, it's like, if there is punishment in the afterlife, it's telling you there's a way out, there's reward, something like that. You don't find a passage like that left to itself. You always have something next to it. If you look up hell, anything to do with hell in the Quran, And I know hell is the word for south of Jerusalem or someplace in the, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the afterlife, hell realms, that sort of stuff. But the
Like
you know,
fear
and
has.
any mention of that is always paired with those things. In the
Mhm.
Bible, you don't get that, and you don't, and the Bible you can skip. Oh, you don't want to talk about the early days of creation and that sort of mythology? Okay, you could skip that. You don't want to talk about the end times? You can skip that. Well,
Mhm.
the Quran kind of comes at you from different angles, so it's harder
Mhm.
to skip the issues that you don't want to talk about, and it kind of talks about more things. But
Mhm.
the and it says, you know, vengeance, you know, you don't need a separate deity, you know, you don't need to turn to say, you don't need to call up something that's against your religion for whatever. Um, you know, because God is the avenging. So you don't have to worry about that. God is, you know, so Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, the first chapter, they're not thought of as different deities. So that's the thing that can you. I mean, it doesn't use the word Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, but you know, you look at what Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva are in terms of what they
Mhm.
mean, and that you find out, you know, that that stuff lines up. But hanging by a thread when the snake is shed. I maybe shouldn't have read the whole thing, but you know, that was talked about. That the Constitution, they're messing with the Constitution. They're trying to take away our the rights for family, all sorts of other stuff. They're messing with the voting and rights and stuff like this.
And things
Are
like
they
that.
considering doing some of this stuff? And they're you know, one of the things is whatever the system of law, the people have to be behind it enough for it to maintain itself. So if the people really stand back and don't do anything about some things, some other things can go with it. And there was a
Or
lot of
are we, could we possibly be conditioned to thinking, you know, that we do have power? Like, in other words, we can
well,
really
there's
them
always
off.
been the limit of you know, it's not really by the people, of the people, for the people,
Right.
because the rich decide who the politicians are, the rich
Yeah.
decide
Yeah.
what the politicians do, and all this stuff to such a degree that,
Right.
and the TV and everything else, and you know, um,
Yeah. And
now
even
if the
punishment.
people stood up and said we don't want this garbage on our television, they'd be fine selling us something else. They were okay with it, but you know, people wasted their energy on, oh Elvis shakes when he dances. You can't have that. And what the stuff they replaced it with? Are you kidding me? Um,
Like people are conditioned even to bicker
but
with each other over
this duplicity,
little
I guess,
things.
I don't know if that's what's supposed to be
Yeah.
changed. This duplicity that people pretend that like the separation of church and state is a phrase because everybody who's in office operates according to their beliefs. If they're going to back some faith-based initiative where they pay for a statue of Christian importance, the town does it, the state does it, the Capitol building does it. You have you have a statue of Muhammad and some other and some biblical prophets and Jesus and stuff paid for by the government in Washington, D.C. The National Chapel has all these statues and stuff on it. And it's like, it doesn't matter whether they're from different religions or not. That was not supposed, there were better uses for state funds. Even if you
Right.
like the art, that was not really appropriate for state funds. But
And
there's always been faith-based initiatives with taxpayer money in America. There's not supposed to be, but there always has been. And so
yeah.
that's what we got to, people got to stand up and say, hey, um,
Enough people would, yeah, definitely have to unite.
and
And
it's like what they drink wine in church, so wine was never outlawed, but the other drugs that people use shamanistically, there's been laws passed that prevents them people from using it in their own religious services. Now, I'm not saying that sorcery or drug use in that respect what is the thing. I'm just saying that how can you allow one and not the other, and you know,
right.
passing laws. It's like there were people who wanted to outlaw chocolate, you know. It wasn't
Mhm.
just it wasn't even coffee and tea and stuff. Chocolate. They wanted to outlaw chocolate because
Wow.
they thought the women would be sitting around eating chocolate too much. It's like there all sorts of people eat too much chocolate, but outlawing it because it's like a substance you don't want, you know. Um, and so some things are laid bare and exposed, and that's kind of addressed by the other ones. But sometimes it's not from the bottom. when the top falls, the rest of it goes with it. That kind of totally makes sense. But what exactly that is, just like Nostradamus, it can happen again and again and again and again, and